The roar of armored engines shattered the fragile silence of dawn, breaking across the flat, scorched plains like a thunderclap. British Challenger, 2 main battle tanks, and Warrior infantry fighting vehicles surged forward, kicking up great clouds of ochre dust that hung in the still morning air like smoke from a battlefield not yet born. The southern perimeter of Basra, Iraq's second-largest city, lay before them, wrapped in concrete, wire, and defiance. The date was early April 2003, and Operation Iraqi Freedom was racing toward its climax. Baghdad still held out to the north, but in the south a different drama was unfolding. A slower burn, a siege not of walls, but of will. And Basra, entrenched, bloodied, and proud, had resisted for weeks. Basra wasn't just another dot on the map. It was a symbol, a crucible, a city with scars that whispered of rebellion and repression, of uprisings crushed and dreams buried beneath sand and ash. After the Gulf War in 1991, the city had dared to rise. Shia militias, civilians, former soldiers, they had fought against Saddam's iron-fisted regime. But the Republican Guard had come with tanks and fire and vengeance. Thousands were killed. The revolt was drowned in blood. The survivors carried the memories like shrapnel in their minds, waiting for the day vengeance could be unshackled. Now, that day had come. Basra mattered in every way a battlefield could. Strategically, it was the gateway to the south, the last major city before the Kuwaiti border, and a vital hub for controlling the southern oil fields. Its pipelines and refineries fed the wealth of Iraq. Its port on the Shatt al-Arab waterway connected the country to the Gulf and the outside world. Whoever held Basra controlled not just roads and rails, but the pulse of the region. It was more than a city. It was a statement. And Saddam's Ba'ath Party meant to hold it at any cost. For the British 1st Armored Division, the campaign had begun with swift maneuvers across the Kuwaiti desert. They had advanced through border towns and bypassed much of the open fighting that had engaged American forces deeper in the west and north. But Basra was different. It wasn't a battlefield that yielded to speed alone. For days, British units had encircled the city, probing its defenses, cutting off roads, and seizing key bridges. They launched targeted raids, eliminated radar sites, and engaged Iraqi army remnants in skirmishes. But the city itself refused to break. Fedayeen Saddam paramilitary forces, entrenched militia fighters, and Ba'athist loyalists had dug in among the civilian population, fighting from schools, mosques, and apartment blocks. Every alley could hide an RPG. Every window, a sniper. British commanders understood that a traditional urban assault would be costly, possibly catastrophic. So, they adapted. Enter the Thunder Runs. Inspired in part by the U.S. Army's bold tactics around Baghdad, British forces began planning a series of fast, violent armored thrusts deep into Basra's urban core. These wouldn't be occupations. They would be penetrations, aimed at smashing resistance, testing the enemy's cohesion, and sowing psychological chaos. A coordinated ballet of armor, infantry, and firepower designed to break the defenders not just physically, but mentally. The first runs were surgical. Columns of Challenger 2s led the charge, their turbine engines screaming, their long 120mm rifled guns trained forward. Behind them rumbled the Warrior IFVs, carrying infantry squads ready to dismount and clear resistance on the move. Apache helicopters circled overhead, their Hellfire missiles loaded, rotors slicing the morning heat. British artillery from the Royal Horse Artillery battalions provided overwatch from outside the city, their guns zeroed in to deliver crushing indirect fire on call. These initial thrusts were met with ferocity. The enemy, often hidden behind civilian facades, struck with RPGs and machine guns from the shadows. The Fedayeen were irregulars, fanatics with little training but endless zeal. They moved on foot, used human shields, fired wildly, then melted away. But against the disciplined coordination of British forces, they struggled. The Challenger 2s proved nearly impervious to their weapons, shrugging off RPG hits and returning fire with devastating precision. British infantry, moving block by block, cleared buildings with grenades and suppressing fire, supported by air and armor in tight integration. The streets turned into kill zones, where once traffic flowed, now firestorms erupted. The British moved deliberately but rapidly, using mobility and overwhelming firepower to unbalance the defenders. Psychological warfare units broadcast surrender instructions over loudspeakers. Leaflets rained from the sky, drones buzzed overhead, and still the runs continued. Each Thunder run was more than a mission. It was a message, a warning to the defenders that the city could be breached at will, that no bastion was safe. That time was running out. The people of Basra, caught between tyranny and liberation, began to rise. Inspired by the boldness of the British raids, some civilians took to the streets, storming Ba'ath Party offices, seizing weapons, attacking Fedayeen strongholds. In neighborhoods long silenced by fear, resistance bloomed. The thunder outside had shaken loose the fury within. By the second week of April, the pressure became too much. The outer defenses began to crumble. Fedayeen fighters were abandoning posts. Iraqi army units, many already demoralized, surrendered in clusters. British forces, sensing the shift, prepared for the final push. But it had started here, on the edge of the city, beneath the rising sun, in clouds of dust and steel and fire. The first roars of engines, the first shock of metal into concrete, the first break in the enemy's resolve. Basra would not fall in a single battle. It would fall because of the momentum born in these moments, the calculated fury of machines and men who refused to stop. The thunder runs had begun. For nearly 2 weeks after the launch of Operation Iraqi Freedom on March 20, 2003, British forces of the 7th Armoured Brigade, the legendary Desert Rats, had established a firm perimeter around Basra, Iraq's second-largest city and a key objective in the south. They had swept in from Kuwait in the war's opening hours with an efficiency honed through decades of armored doctrine, pushing through border towns and bypassing lighter resistance to reach the city's outer limits. But here, at the threshold of Basra, the advance stalled, not from failure or fear, but from the brutal complexity of urban warfare that loomed ahead. The city, once bustling with life, had transformed into a fortress of fear and fanaticism. Its outskirts were thick with resistance. Saddam Hussein's paramilitary Fedayeen, garbed in black, fanatical in their loyalty, moved like shadows through the alleyways. They knew every twist in the road, every side street, every alley too narrow for tanks. The defenders were a mix of die-hard Ba'athists, irregulars with little training but lethal resolve, and remnants of the Iraqi army who had melted into the civilian population. These fighters didn't line up in trenches or face off across open plains. They hid in homes, in schools, in mosques. They fought from rooftops, behind market stalls, from the shadows. The cost of every meter was blood. Reconnaissance units reported sniper fire from minarets, RPG ambushes launched from crowds, roadside bombs buried in potholes or concealed in abandoned vehicles. British patrols probing the city were hit with bursts of sudden violence. An RPG strike here, a machine gun ambush there, followed by quick disappearances. The kind of fighting that didn't just wound bodies but wore down morale. In the narrow streets of Basra, the advantage of British armor meant little. The Challenger 2s were invincible to small arms, yes, but they couldn't see around corners, couldn't fire at ghosts. British commanders, wary of turning Basra into a modern-day Stalingrad, exercised restraint. Memories of urban bloodbaths in Grozny and Mogadishu hovered like phantoms. This war was supposed to be swift and decisive, not a grinding meat grinder. So they waited, encircled the city, tightened the noose, raided on the periphery. They tried to break the defenders without destroying the city. But in that stillness, something darker began to grow. Inside Basra, chaos reigned. The city's infrastructure had crumbled. Electricity flickered out. Water pumps failed. Sewage systems overflowed into the streets. Hospitals, already underfunded and overburdened, collapsed beneath the weight of wounded and dying. Food and medical supplies dwindled. And amid the misery, Saddam's loyalists ruled with terror. Civilians suspected of aiding the British were dragged from their homes and executed in the street. Rumors swirled of mass graves being prepared. Children starved. Women begged for water at gunpoint. What had once been a city of 2 million became a prison. The British knew they could not wait forever. Pressure came from every direction. Media scrutiny, political corridors in London, military brass in Kuwait. But most of all, it came from within the ranks. The soldiers saw the suffering. They heard the crack of gunfire inside the city at night, and knew civilians were paying the price. And so the plan changed, not out of desperation, but out of resolve. What emerged was not a siege, but a storm. British commanders, Major General Robin Brims among them, devised a new tactic drawn from a different kind of war. It was aggressive, audacious, and dangerous. Armored thrusts straight into the city's heart, not to occupy or hold ground, but to strike like a hammer. Short, sharp, shock and awe missions. They would move fast, hit hard, then pull back. The aim was not to seize territory, but to tear holes in the defenders' morale, disrupt their coordination, and show them, and the civilians of Basra, that the regime's grip was slipping. These became known as the Thunder Runs. The concept was as brutal as it was elegant. Challenger 2 tanks and Warrior IFVs would race into the city in heavily armed columns, targeting known Fedayeen command centers, Ba'ath party offices, and strongpoints identified through intelligence and aerial surveillance. Apache helicopters and RAF aircraft would provide close air support. Artillery would range the flanks. Infantry would dismount at key junctions to clear resistance and destroy caches. But the real weapon was speed. Every run was meant to be overwhelming, like a hammer blow between the ribs. No warning, no negotiation, no pause. The noise, the dust, the shock of it all, it wasn't just to kill, but to destabilize. Resistance fighters wouldn't know where to run, who to follow, or what came next. Civilians, terrified but observant, would see British tanks tearing down roads supposedly held by Saddam's loyalists. And slowly, the psychological landscape would begin to shift. It was a gamble, but the British were ready to bet on it. The first Thunder Run tore through Basra like a lightning bolt. A spearhead of tanks punched through the southern gates, blasting apart barricades and fortified checkpoints. Warrior IFVs surged behind them, deploying infantry squads at key choke points. Fedayeen fighters, caught by surprise, fired wildly from windows and alleyways, only to be met by 30mm cannons and 50-caliber machine guns. Buildings used as sniper nests were reduced to rubble in minutes. British infantry kicked in doors, cleared stairwells, pulled down Ba'athist flags from government buildings. The whole assault took hours, but it echoed like a bomb through the city's soul. They didn't stay. After hitting their targets, the British forces pulled back to the perimeter, leaving behind the smoldering wreckage of regime control and the stunned silence of a city shaken awake. It wasn't over. More runs would follow, each one longer, deeper, deadlier. But in that first raid, the tide had begun to turn. And in the silence that followed, the people of Basra began to whisper, not of fear, but of freedom. On the morning of April 5th, 2003, with the sky overcast and dust already rising from the roads, British forces initiated their boldest move yet, a full-scale armored thrust into the heart of Basra. This would be no reconnaissance probe, no limited engagement. This was the first significant Thunder Run, fast, loud, lethal. The objective was clear: punch down Highway 6, the spine of the city's southern sector, and shatter the hold of Saddam's loyalists through the sheer weight of fire and momentum. The assault would be spearheaded by the Royal Scots Dragoon Guards in their Challenger 2 main battle tanks, with close infantry support from the Princess of Wales's Royal Regiment riding in warrior infantry fighting vehicles. The column began its movement at first light, engines growling, exhaust coughing into the chilly morning air as the armored behemoths surged forward. Challenger 2s, each weighing over 60 tons and armored with the latest Chobham composite plating, led the advance. Their turrets swiveled slowly, scanning the rooftops and alleyways for threats. Behind them, warriors followed in tight formation, hatches open, soldiers inside tense and alert, fingers resting lightly on triggers, eyes scanning for movement. As the British armored spear pushed deeper into Basra, the city awoke like a wounded beast. Resistance came fast and vicious. From the upper stories of abandoned buildings and shattered homes, dark figures emerged. Fedayeen Saddam fighters dressed in black, armed with AK-47s, PKM machine guns, and RPG-7s slung over their backs. They moved like ghosts, darting across rooftops, firing from windows, vanishing down side alleys. It was a textbook urban ambush, but the British were ready. The first RPGs arced from the rooftops, smoke trails spiraling toward the lead Challenger. One struck the glacis plate, exploding in a burst of orange and black. The tank didn't flinch. Its armor shrugged off the hit like rain against steel. A second RPG slammed into the side skirt of another Challenger, sending a shockwave across the street. Again, no penetration, no effect. The British tanks responded with thunderous authority. Their 120mm rifled guns unleashed sabot rounds and high-explosive shells with pinpoint precision, each impact turning concrete strongpoints into clouds of dust and flame. The warriors moved in close behind, accelerating to stay within the protection of the tanks. Their 30mm autocannons raked buildings with suppressive fire as the rear hatches dropped and dismounted infantry poured out. The soldiers moved with practiced efficiency, clearing buildings, storming alleyways, and silencing resistance pockets. They worked in fire teams, bounding from cover to cover, using hand signals and shouted commands to coordinate movement. Every doorway was a potential kill zone, every rooftop a threat, but they pushed forward with methodical aggression. The battle became a rolling storm of steel and fire. Every few blocks brought fresh contact. Fedayeen fighters, emboldened by fanaticism and fueled by desperation, launched ambush after ambush, but each was repelled with cold efficiency. The challengers smashed through roadblocks and barricades, sometimes flattening cars and rubble piles with brute force. Their coaxial machine guns mowed down exposed fighters in alleys. The warriors delivered fire teams to rooftops and second-story windows where Iraqi snipers had taken positions. It was urban warfare at its most intimate and unforgiving. Despite the ferocity of the resistance, the British advance did not falter. The Thunder Run's velocity was its shield. Speed was everything. The objective was not to grind into a protracted street-by-street slog, but to punch through with such violence that the defenders would be psychologically shattered, disoriented, panicked, scattered. And it was working. Radio intercepts crackled with confusion among the Fedayeen. British electronic warfare units listened in as enemy commanders tried desperately to regroup and reorganize, but their transmissions were increasingly fragmented and chaotic. Civilians cowered inside their homes as the battle rolled past. The roar of engines, the thunder of tank shells, and the scream of gunfire echoed down the narrow streets of Basra like an approaching storm. For those brave enough to peek through curtains or from behind rubble, what they saw was both terrifying and revelatory. British tanks rolling where only Saddam's regime had ruled, columns of armored vehicles cutting through neighborhoods once thought impenetrable. Word spread quickly, not just among the enemy, but among the oppressed. The regime wasn't invincible. The deeper the British forces pushed, the more apparent the cracks in the defenders' cohesion became. The initial ambushes were sharp, coordinated. But by mid-morning, they began to lose cohesion. Fighters abandoned fixed positions, leaving behind spent RPG tubes and discarded rifles. Some tried to blend in with the civilian population. Others fled entirely. Still, pockets of resistance remained. Snipers on rooftops, gunmen in alleyways, small cells with nothing left to lose. British commanders maintained strict fire discipline, determined to avoid civilian casualties. Rules of engagement were clear: only engage armed threats. But in a city where combatants didn't wear uniforms and weapons could appear from beneath a blanket or out of a market stall, the line was razor thin. Still, the professionalism of the British forces held. Rooms were cleared. Suspects were detained. Fighters were killed, but civilians were spared whenever possible. By noon, the British column had achieved its objectives. Command posts had been hit. Ba'ath Party offices were in ruins. Enemy strongpoints were shattered. The defenders had been shocked into silence. And then, as suddenly as it began, the Thunder Run ended. The British forces regrouped and withdrew from the city center, trailing smoke and dust, their engines humming like metal beasts returning to slumber. They had not stayed to occupy, not yet, but they had left their mark. The defenders had been bloodied. The illusion of control had been broken. That day, on April 5th, the people of Basra witnessed the beginning of the end. The Thunder Run had not just opened a road, it had opened a crack in the regime's armor, one that would soon split wide open. Civilians, many terrified but some waving cautiously, watched as tanks blasted through roadblocks and fighters scattered in panic. For many in Basra, it was the first time they saw the Ba'athist hold on their city begin to crumble. Each block became a test of fire and coordination. British JTACs, Joint Terminal Attack Controllers, coordinated air support overhead, calling in fast-moving RAF Tornado jets and American A-10 Warthogs when pockets of resistance proved stubborn. Precision-guided munitions obliterated weapons caches and command centers hidden in residential blocks. The message was clear: no quarter would be given to Saddam's enforcers. But this was no cakewalk. The enemy adapted quickly. They moved in small, nimble groups, using alleyways and underground passages. They laid IEDs, set ambushes, and tried to draw the British into traps. On several occasions, British units were pinned down, taking fire from multiple directions. But discipline held. Close-quarters engagements broke out in courtyards and building interiors. British infantry cleared homes with grenades and bayonets, methodically moving from one corner to another. One notable skirmish occurred near the Basra Technical Institute, where a platoon from the PWRR came under intense RPG fire from a group of Fedayeen holed up in the administration building. A warrior was hit and disabled. Under covering fire from a Challenger 2, British troops flanked the building, breached it with explosives, and cleared it room by room. When the fight ended, more than a dozen enemy fighters lay dead. Not a single British soldier was lost in that engagement, a testament to training and precision. Over the next 48 hours, British forces launched successive Thunder Runs, each one pushing deeper into Basra. Intelligence assets and local civilians helped identify Ba'athist headquarters, weapons depots, and radio stations broadcasting pro-Saddam propaganda. These were priority targets. By April 6th, a daring raid led by the Black Watch Regiment targeted the city's central Ba'ath Party headquarters. Under cover of darkness and a smokescreen, British forces stormed the compound, seizing documents and disabling communication lines used by regime loyalists. As the pressure mounted, something unexpected began to happen. The local population, emboldened by the visible weakening of regime forces, began to rise. In the northern districts, Shia civilians, many of whom had suffered under Saddam's rule, began to take to the streets. Some waved white flags, Others hurled stones at retreating Ba'ath fighters. In some neighborhoods, British troops were met with cheers, handshakes, and cries of "thank you" in broken English. It was a stark contrast to the propaganda of an entire nation hostile to Western forces. By April 7th, British armor had reached the city center. Major command and control points had been destroyed. Resistance was fragmenting. A final thunder run was launched, this time with the goal of securing the entire city and bringing down the last pockets of resistance. It was fast and brutal. The last Ba'athist strongholds, mostly around government buildings, collapsed under the combined assault of tanks, infantry, and air power. By April 8th, Basra had fallen. The city was now in coalition hands, secured without a full-scale siege or drawn-out urban campaign. The thunder runs had worked, showcasing a new kind of urban combat doctrine: speed, shock, and overwhelming firepower. In the days that followed, British engineers began restoring water and power. Civilians emerged in droves, mosques opened, schools began to reopen. The old regime's symbols were torn down. Fedayeen fighters who had terrorized the city fled or melted into the population. British forces, now acting as peacekeepers, worked alongside local leaders to restore order. But victory came with cost. Throughout the campaign, several British soldiers were killed in action. They were mourned by comrades and honored in solemn ceremonies under the desert sun. Civilian casualties also occurred, tragic but inevitable in such a densely populated environment. British commanders were haunted by the complexity of fighting an enemy who hid behind civilians, who used children as human shields, who attacked from mosques and hospitals. Yet the thunder runs of Basra remain one of the most tactically significant operations of the Iraq War. It demonstrated that rapid, targeted armored assaults could fracture enemy control in even the most hardened urban areas. It validated the use of armored maneuver in complex terrain, and it showed the world that modern British forces could fight and win in the unforgiving streets of a hostile city. More than that, it lifted the shadow of Saddam from the city that had suffered so long. The story of Basra is not just about tanks and tactics. It's about resolve. It's about leadership under fire, the bond between infantry and armor, and the moral complexity of modern warfare. It's about young men who rolled into a foreign city, not knowing what they'd find, and made history by their courage, discipline, and humanity. They came as warriors. They left as liberators. The thunder runs of Basra are a tribute to every soldier who rolled down those dusty streets, who stared down ambushes, who pushed forward when it would have been easier to turn back. It's a story not only of war, but of a moment when victory wasn't measured in land taken, but in fear broken. And for the people of Basra, it was the day the thunder rolled, and silence followed.